coastal cliffs are filled with nothing but what have become white noise to its residents. From a gentle thrum and chuck of a windmill nestled in the industrial cliffs, to the wind that darted between the rocks and whistled as it ran by. Waves lapped and crashed at the jagged rocks, drawing away and falling back against the damp stones of the night. Crickets, bees, and more insects alike all came to life in the dark, hidden amidst the rolling grass and moss. Owls and creatures of the night fluttered between islands, seeking them out in hopes of food. Roses swayed in the breeze of the cliffs, thorns nicking and brushing up against one another. Full, flushed petals dribbling fresh water from a recent watering earlier that day, and the citrus trees swayed in the night, wet leaves reflecting the crescent moon in the sky. Sylvester leaned over the sofa, clicking off the static of a radio with a huff and coming to his feet with a groan. Resting a hand on his lower back, he leaned backwards until a crack resounded throughout the living room. Wilson looked up with tired eyes, but rested his head once more at the noise, snorting quietly and shifting across the floorboards closer to his sleeping dogs. He settled down a book he'd been reading on the arm of a chair, not bothering to leave a bookmark as he'd only just begun reading it, and heading through the corridors up to his room, up the stairs, into the tower. The candlelight of the tower flickered, his eyes darting across the black smudged corkboard above him. Strings and pins pushed as deeply into the board as it would let him. Attached were a plethora of documents and pictures of endships, employee profiles, fabric from uniforms, fabric from sheet and curtains and napkins, black-purple glass dangling from a clear bag, and a bundle of leather holding several marble-sized objects. What his gaze lingered on the most though was a single potted rose nestled on the windowsill, blooming and reaching high towards the glass, facing where the sun once shone and would continue to shine once the moon settled beyond the horizon. He sighed, running a finger along the petal's edge and letting it run down the stem before he gently cut the rose between three of his fingers, drawing closer to the flower. His gaze never tore from the coiling red petals, staring at the swirls they formed as if he were in a trance before pulling back and turning the pot around in the window, letting the flowers bounce back to its former position. He turned his attention towards the leather-bound book resting on the counter, taking it in his hand once more and flicking through the pages until he landed on one particular entry. The words were messy, blotted with white-blue ink drops and scrawled with quick haste. Sylvester would admit himself, his handwriting wasn't the neatest, however this was most likely the closest to chicken scratch his writing had ever neared. It was still legible, barely. Scanning the list of ingredients, he let out a low hum and began to move around the room, taking items from shelves and laying them out on the table before him. Each jar sat lined upon the table in an unorganized mess, each ingredient a key of what was yet to come. With the mortar and pestle, Sylvester began to grind together the dandelions, shredded axolotl scales, azalea leaves, and honey. The crunch of the scales shattering under the stone pestle and becoming a fine pink powder. The powder of the petals began to submerge and mix into the honey, swelling into the golden liquid and sprinkling it with flecks of pink. Once he was content with the mixture, he took it over to the brewing stand and lit the blaze powder underneath. After pouring it into a bottle, he ran the pad of his finger on the spiked top of the stand until he felt it draw blood, letting several droplets drip into the bottle as it began to bubble. Once the blood had begun to simmer into the mixture, next was several scraps of neverwort and 3 thorns he had plucked in the roses, watching the mixture turn from gold to a brilliant burning amber over the next half hour. When the brewing stand's supply of blaze powder finally fizzled out, he carefully lifted the bottle out of its clamp, placing it onto a table before turning back to the book's worn pages. Clicking his tongue, Sylvester pulled open a drawer and took out a scalpel from the neatly lined up tools inside, setting it on a cutting board. He pulled down some lavender that was hanging to dry in the window, alongside some of the Ravager hide that Wilson had shed a month or so back. Finally, he took an iridescent ink sac from the water basin, the neon blues brushing off and clinging to his shirt's sleeve. He first made the incision along the fatty base of the ink sac, bright glowing ink oozing out and splattering across the cutting board. Quickly setting down his scalpel, he raised the ink sac so no more ink was spilt and began to stuff it with lavender. Once the bundle was inside, Sylvester took a spool of thread and began to stitch the ink sac back together, wrapping it in Ravager hide afterwards and hanging it over the brewing stand once more. The sack slowly twirled in place as Sylvester set up a pile of blaze powder underneath the sack, lighting the splint underneath and slowly letting it simmer and burn. Once the Ravager hide had charred into black, he took it off the brewing stand and settled it into an empty cauldron, pouring his current concoction over it and began to grind it all together into a fine paste. His end result was like most tests he'd produced over the last month, a deep purple paste with orange swirls faintly glowing in the bottom of the cauldron. However, unlike most tests, this time he was going to try and apply a paste to organic matter, more so himself. He began to wonder that perhaps he was being too hasty. After all, he didn't even know all that much about end beasts to start with, or even that they could inflict these kinds of parasitic wounds onto people. And of course there's the fact that he had no idea what the effects the paste would have when combined with organic matter, as opposed to just being used on loose shards. Nevertheless, there was no time like the present, and without thinking any further, he plunged his hand into the paste, watching his glassy fingers submerge under the ooze. And that's when everything blew out of proportions and up in his face. Sylvester muttered curses under his breath as his skin began to burn and ripple, falling backwards. The cauldron teetered and tipped over, thick paste slowly spilling out and onto the floor. His arm writhed as if something was trying to break free from his skin, his other hand slamming down onto it and trying to calm it, yet to no avail. Soon it burst, blood splashing across his clothes, across the floorboard, across the bottles, semi-opaque spikes jetting out from each bloom and popping them like bubbles. Blood oozed and dripped down each spike as it climbed up and up his arm, shredding and tearing through his shirt sleeves. He felt faint, heartbeat pounding into his ears. The once soft light of the candles now seared white in his vision, head bobbing as he tried to stay upright. Darling, come back to bed. The voice was soft, buttery, and the words cut through his mind like a never-out sword. Sylvester coughed, watching a splatter of blood splash across the floorboards. Sylves, where's Jack? It was like the room was spinning. Blinding white curling into the few licks of what he could see of the room, vision a blur. The crystal-like substance continued to encroach until it finally began to come to a halt at his shoulder, and the world finally stopped spinning. Sylvester took a moment to stabilize himself, picking up the cauldron and scooping up the paste with his other gloved hand, throwing it back inside with a wet thwack. His breath was left ragged and laboured, eyes half-lidded as what had just occurred slowly began to sink into his mind, holding up the arm in front of him with disbelief. The longer he stared at it, the more and more he could see the finer parts of what had occurred. Small flecks of what he could only compare to oil and water riding up the inside of his arm in streams akin to veins. He curled a finger and watched as the glass tensed up, clinking like a cacophony of wine glasses. With his movement, the flecks gathered and pooled at the tip of his finger, growing darker. The more and more Sylvester stared at the appendage and flexed and moved them in wonder, the more and more entranced he became by the oddity of it all. Although he'd loved to analyse the effects that had begun to overtake his body, countless sleepless nights preparing for this moment had left his conscience slipping, mind wandering in a tired stupor. It was time for some long-needed rest. With the clink of two fingers clicking together, he fell into the cushions and sheets of his bed with a loud thump, particles dispersing around his body into the air. His head turned on the cushions to look out of the window, watching as the first few droplets of rain began to streak across the glass with a sigh. The not-so-subtle thunks of Wilson's footsteps up the stairs and across the landing made Sylvester smile bitterly as his cow-like frame snuffled into the room. Wilson nudged his head against Sylvester's arm, tapping it twice with his tusk and looking back up at the man. "It's all right, boy, it's just a flesh wound," he reassured Wilson, although perhaps it was more so reassurance from himself. The Ravager snorted in response, nudging Sylvester with its tusks one more time before settling his head atop of his stomach. Tentatively, Sylvester rested the glassy arm atop of Wilson, patting his head and rubbing an ear between two fingers. He'd look further into it tomorrow, perhaps, when he's got a clearer conscience, when he's had sleep, the rain had passed, when the glass had settled.